with the questions of Al-Qaeda. If you also follow the money and also follow the historical analysis, Al-Qaeda was funded by CIA, by the United States military, right, to quell the resistance in Afghanistan, who was fighting Russia at that time, which were a communist country. So during the Cold War, Russia was our enemy. The expansion of Russia was Afghanistan, and they funded Al-Qaeda to fight off Russians. And what happened was the U.S. left, and folks in Al-Qaeda got pissed off and started this really rebel. And I'm not supporting Al-Qaeda. I'm totally nonviolent. I believe in nonviolent means, but it's important to understand the history. And it's very similar to what's happened in the Philippines, where the U.S. funded Abu Sayyaf, which was a resistance group that were fighting against martial law in the 1980s and 1990s, actually 1980s. And they funded Abu Sayyaf. Abu Sayyaf got pissed off because they were neglected, and it became this rebel resistance group. So again, it's important to understand it in terms of materialism and also understand it in terms of history, right? And then there's always a problem when we put activists or organizers or movement leaders on this superstar status, where like Nelson Mandela, he definitely did some amazing work. Where 27 years of his life, and he ended up getting a divorce at the end, right? Like there's all these different things that went down, but all these people behind the scenes were a result from their organizing. It was a mass-based people that resisted, from workers to peasants to students to tribal leaders. And you can't talk about racism without linking it to the economic system, without linking it to classism. So I think it's important to really look at it from a holistic, historical, materialistic perspective, and it's not just one reason. And again, totally for peace, love, struggle with joy. That's my daily motto. But at the same instance, if people need to resist, they gotta do what they gotta do to protect their families. So.
There was a question for Lubna.
Okay, so I guess this is great. I'll go last to talk about what the PYN is doing for more practical means to support steadfastness of Palestinians inside Palestine. Well, number one, a lot of the things that we talked about today are the challenges facing Palestinians and facing specifically our generation of Palestinian youth transnationally. A fragmented leadership, corruption in our leadership, co-optation of our movement, a lot of normalization within spaces both inside Palestine and outside Palestine. These are sort of the things that are inhibiting our ability as young people to really assume our rights and responsibility towards the freedom of our land and people. And so these are the first things that we are really trying to put forth within the Palestinian Youth Network settings. Now, you might just think of us as another organization, but it's been over 20 years that Palestinian youth transnationally have been meeting, and whether it's virtually or in summer programs or general conferences, we're meeting regularly, multiple times a year. We're coming from over 33 countries. Half of us don't even speak the same language. We're coming from different gendered, religious, sexual, factional, political ideologies and backgrounds and experiences. And so it's sort of to bring us together as Palestinian youth and negotiate the terms of homeland, negotiate the challenges that we're experiencing as a young generation. We really assumed that there would be so many differences based on sort of the vulnerability of our movement at this time. But what we found is that a lot of us really have very similar experiences, because as was discussed today, a lot of our challenges are being stemmed from systems of power, systems of oppression that challenge justice and equity in our communities. And so to center a discussion among all of us that positions power and privilege and our resources and strengths and re-examines the history of the Palestinian movement, the history of the Palestinian leadership, the history of other movements, other third world liberation movements, and talking about where we are now as a generation and identifying our challenges and our strengths, we're able to strategically plan how we can work collectively to, revive a youth role in our movement. There's something very interesting about the Palestinian case, and I don't know if many people, I'm not actually sure if this is present in other communities, but it's been 62 years since our liberation movement was really sort of culminated in 1948. And something that's very interesting is that now we are missing sort of a gap in terms of that iconic leadership. So a lot of those very iconic images and leaders and the people who were spearheading the movement are dying slowly, whether they were intellectuals or political leaders. And there's sort of none of that no iconic leaders that really inspire the Palestinian people transnationally, that are telling us that we're still one people, let's keep going. And so that's sort of something that we as a young generation are like thinking about and saying, we as a young generation, we don't want to allow our histories to be rewritten for us, that we want to maintain the justice and worthiness of our cause because we know it's premised on anti-colonial ideologies. And so one of the practical things that we're doing to support steadfastness in Palestine is really centering the most marginalized within our groups at the center of analysis. So those who are most impacted by occupation, by colonization, who really experience it in the physical sense, their voices aren't being put to the side for us to say, oh, okay, let's come all together at the table and try to discuss this, and people with more power, privilege, or educational experience have more legitimacy in that space. That's not the case for us. All of our experiences inform why we're at the table, and we're working really hard to sort of continue a legacy of justice-centered activism. And that's it. You can tune in. I think will this be present on the website? Ghazi?
This will be online.
It will be online, okay, if you wanted to revisit any parts of this. And we want to thank you all for coming again. And if you didn't sign the sign-up sheet, sign it so that we can include you in more events and maybe organize with you in the future. But before we leave, Armel's going to sort of lead us in a solidarity chant.
All right, so we're going to do the unity clap, which folks might probably know, but the history of the unity clap is, it stems from the farm workers in the 1920s and 1930s, when the Latino farm workers and the Filipino farm workers came together, fighting the grape companies who were trying to exploit them in terms of labor and wages and being exposed to like really unhealthy, environmentally problematic conditions. So they came together, spoke different languages, and what they did was they clapped slowly in unison, really, really slow, and then they would go really, really fast and scream at the top of your lungs. And what we do is we say Isam Bagsak. So everybody say it with me. Isam Bagsak. Which means one down, one fall, which means we're one step closer to where we want to be by having this meeting right here, by standing in solidarity with all the folks in third world liberation movements. We're one step closer to where we want to be. All right? So let's start it off. Anybody want to start it?
One thing I forgot to mention is that there's literature for Bayan and for the Palestinian Youth Network presented at these two tables. If you'd like to make a donation, we definitely appreciate it. It would definitely help us. But also, something that we wanted, boycott, divestment, sanctions was mentioned a few times tonight. We wanted to be that one thing that we can all really get plugged into. So there's some literature available right over there next to Sammy and Sammy, show us who you are. And there's some literature about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions and ways